Alrighty. Pardon me. Welcome. This is Jonathan Albin and Creative Differences today here on NycosRPG. Happy Friends Day, everybody. May have told you before I changed the days of the week to more suit my lifestyle since I'm no longer in the quote workday world. And so we are today going to be looking at what I call the other flavors. When you are enjoying a meal, sometimes the fundamentals of the recipe are pretty easy. You know, if you're looking at, say, hang on a second, I'm almost there. There he is. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm proud to say that Abletop is with us this morning. Hey, how's it going, Scott? We're live on Creative Differences on NycosRPG. Yes, today I decided that I would be. The fact that I saw you online didn't have anything to do with it. I was already setting up Creative Differences, so it's not like I assumed that we're going to be going to war on any given topic. But Creative Differences, the episodes I do under this heading are those episodes where what I'm talking about is either controversial or perhaps a new perspective that maybe I don't think very many other people are aware of or have considered. So today we're talking about what I call the other flavors. When you do a meal, normally we think of the basics. You know, breakfast, lunch, dinner. We think of bread and water, meat and potatoes. You know, simple things, simple fare. But sometimes the things that we enjoy are a blend. You know, if you're looking at, say, a spaghetti or a pasta of some sort, or maybe certain vegetable medleys, you'll have multiple flavors in one. And so what I'm going to talk about are the parts of role-playing games that most people don't necessarily even consider or track, mainly because there's so much going on in the world already that they don't think about it. So these are the other flavors, if you get what I'm saying. These are the other things we're going to add to role play games that really make the sessions that we run pop, really make things different for the players. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you're looking at the screen, you probably see the top points we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about poisons, venoms, and other toxins that might be in your games, episode over episode. You know, they don't happen all the time, but every once in a while you'll run into a creature that has these side effects or whatever. We're going to talk about disease and illness. I think this is a topic that in most roleplay games we completely ignore because illness and disease are not things we necessarily want to think of in our own case, and we certainly don't want to think about our character catching a cold or our persona being unable to function for whatever reason. Then I want to talk about the next one I want to talk about is weather and precipitation and the effects that would have on a game session. And finally, the last two are fog, haze, and dust, and crowds and collateral damage. So these are all things that you don't have to add every week, but if you add these once in a while, it adds a major impact to your game sessions. So we're going to start at the top: poisons, venoms, and other toxins. I speak of it this way because NycosRPG isn't necessarily set up as a single genre, but it might have something or a situation where you run into not only a creature that might bite you or a plant that might, rub off on your skin, but you might be finding entire barrels or gallon jars or something of these various substances. So since you're on the line with me, Scott, how do you normally handle such things when you're running? So all or nothing, yes or no, binary response, sort of. And when you say suffer the consequences, what are the kinds of consequences that you perceive for poison or toxins? So you use conditions in your games on a regular basis? Because what I've found is most game masters don't think about lasting conditions or extenuating circumstances in their games. If they if they succeed at something, then there's no effect at all, and if they fail, then it's usually a pile of damage or a reduction in move rate or something like that. There's not really much in terms of conditions that they can apply. Oh, that's fair. Oh, okay. Okay. Hi, Mom. I hear her in the background. Well, so what I've done with poison and venom and such in the past is if they are uh, natural toxins, in other words, something that's injected by an insect or ingested by swallowing or whatever, then first thing I do is I put a delay on them. In other words, they don't affect you immediately. And most game masters I know don't do that. Most of them don't give a time limit on it or a later trigger because, like I said, many things like an alternate flavor like this simply would be too distracting to have to track or to maintain over time. And so they, if a snake bites you, you're immediately struck for whatever the effect is. But what I found is that it adds an interesting twist for them to say fight off an insect swarm and not right immediately, but when they get to their first long rest or whatever, then they suffer either the inability to sleep or perhaps one of them is uncontrollably giggling throughout the night or some other effect of the toxin. Therefore, I don't even make their saving throw initially. I just annotate that, okay, we had the attack of the uh, dengue beetle or whatever, and after the fight is over, one or two of them are uh, dealing with the effects or whatever, and therefore they make their saving throw at that later time. What I found is that when you do that, several things happen. Number one, the players aren't sure what's going on and panic. Oh, why are we rolling dice now? What has this got to do with anything? We haven't fought in 2 hours. But it more accurately reflects the way that toxins work. They don't they unless you get hit with a instantaneous lethal dose by some giant version of the creature or whatever. Generally, there's not enough toxin in your blood for you to even notice at first, or it certainly doesn't necessarily get to the organ that it might directly impact. And by therefore delaying it, it adds a level of realism to it because that if you got bit by a snake, it's gonna hurt like H because you got bit, but that's far cry from what the effect will be when your leg blows up like a balloon and turns purple. Lot worse things that can happen if you leave them untended. And I think that's one of the things that I found is really useful about the kind of a nuanced approach is that the players have to consider, you know, what they do immediately after, right? So if you got a bite during a fight, what do you do to care for that? And I don't think very many people, game masters or players, think about that until it's already happened. You know, they don't consider, well, did we have fresh water? Was I able to clean the wound? Was I able to get out any particulates that might be in the puncture wound or whatever? That's true. Well, I find that funny. I don't know any group that doesn't want it to feel real at some level. They want to, they want, you know, for example, we talked the other day about the fact that in role playing we can wish fulfill things that we can't actually do, and so we want to feel the wind on our face if we go running. We want to, you know, feel the fatigue in our legs after a 4 mile hike or whatever, because we haven't ever really done that kind of a hike. You know what I'm saying? You have to explain that. Book GP. What does that mean? Oh, book. I heard. I now deciphered what you said. Bookkeeping. Bookkeeping. You were saying they don't want to have a little tally mark for how many times they, how many torches they burned or whatever. They want to just. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the reason why I brought this topic up in particular is that there are, you know, probably dozens and dozens of creature encounters and plant encounters that could be made more dynamic if you had to consider whether or not you're actually walking through poison ivy. You know, whether or not that annoying group of gnats was actually carrying dengue fever or something. So by mentioning dengue fever, by the way, that also lets me transition to the next one, which is kind of an askance to that, and that's disease and illness. Many times these things can be vector effects. So you spent the night in a foggy swamp. If the players haven't, if the players didn't write into their uh, inventory mosquito netting, if they didn't take precautions, the possibility of them catching something is actually, you know, numerically quite high. You know, a person who is a friend of mine was in Southeast Asia, and they said if you're in Southeast Asia, especially more towards the continent, then you end up with either uh, having malaria or experiencing somebody else with malaria or whatever. The chances of getting sick or dealing with somebody who is sick is really, really high in those kinds of climates. And how many times have you actually had a player group have to deal with dysentery? Not a pretty disease by any stretch, but you know, you've got a games group that loves poo and pee humor, and it's all funny until they all have the, you know, the trots. How often do you think you've used any form of disease in your game? Ooh, there's a jump. That's fair. That's fair. It definitely it can be treated as a disease. Many people treat it as a curse, and well, okay, but that's only if you ascribe to the werewolf's bite the transmission possibility. For example, we've talked before about the Nycos phenomenon for lycanthropism. It only can strike people who are of the second genesis anyway, because they are the only carriers that remain on the planet. And therefore, the effect of it as a disease can only affect other sect gen. Right. But my point for mentioning the disease and stuff is that there aren't any mechanisms at all in roleplay games for them, other than as a condition, as a modifier to your initiative or a modifier to your uh, combat skill or dexterity. Right there's really not a there's no mechanism for tracking how long a disease will last and whether or not you can overcome it. And yet, from a storytelling portion, that there are great examples in literature of a group having to shelter in place for a few days because of one or two of the members being incapacitated by this plague or that disease or whatever. Yeah. Well, if we look at historicity, you think of Alexander the Great. Did not He was very young when he met his demise, and he met his demise either by poisoning or disease. And the part of the world he was in, the possibility of column A or column B was actually quite high because he did have his enemy. He did have his enemies, but he also was in a place where catching something was well, and the awareness of illness protocol and cleanliness and everything like that would have definitely not been in his. Sure, sure, sure. Now, speaking of being incapacitated, the next one we're going to talk about is weather and precipitation. And when was the last time that you can recall, as a GM, describing the players the gentle rain of a morning and then having them have to deal with their gear all getting soaked by mid afternoon? Right. On a horse with no name? Ah, okay. So I guess they couldn't be on horses with no name. Okay, gotcha. But you had them have to deal with dust then and sand. So what impacts would that have on the game session then? What realistic things would they have to be putting up with in the game session if you were dealing with sandstorm in particular? I gotcha. Yeah, so the reason why I mention weather and precipitation is that on a given day anywhere in the world, there's basically a 1 in 20 chance of at least something strange happening in the weather. Some significant change from the day before, whether it be a sudden rainfall or extreme overcast, maybe some hail or sleet in certain areas because of the weather patterns. How would you say that you've built weather patterns for the game systems that you run, or is that pretty much a hand wave? Just like, well, okay, I see an episode of the world in around 80 days that we're going to have to do about dealing with those incidentals. Cool, cool. Now, one of the points that I try to make about weather is that because weather only changes a small portion, I think on terra firma here, based on the size of our planet and the amount of mountains and stuff that we have across the planet, weather has a roughly 80% chance per day of remaining exactly the same as the day before. It's how we are able to discern the differences in the change of seasons, for example, because it isn't over 1 or 2 days that we go, oh, we're now into the next portion of the cycle. If we're particularly astute and we're involved with astronomical stuff, we might know that, okay, the sun has passed its zenith for this season, and so now we're moving from season to season. But that doesn't even reflect itself in the actual weather pattern. But the 80% shift, 80% likely remainder of being similar as today really does. And so even without going so far as yet having the actual episode on how to add that to your game, put that little feather in your cap that it's roughly an 80% maintenance. That way, on any given day, just, as you're starting the session, simply determine, okay, weather yesterday was normal, so what should we have for today? And then roll that percentage dice roll. And if it's 81 or better, there's a change. It can be up or down, whether it could be cooler than it was yesterday or it could be hotter than it was yesterday. Maybe humidity has changed, maybe the barometric pressure has dropped, but that way all you're doing is just giving yourself a reminder to predicate a difference that's often enough to remind them that there's weather. You know what I'm saying? Because one of the things I don't think we do much of is tracking and maintaining gear per se. We just, like you said, hand wave most of it and just say, well, you pack up all your stuff and away we go. And never a thought for, oh, it's going to rain, so I better put my paper in the back and bottom of my notebook. Put it back in the bottom of the knapsack so it doesn't get wet. Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that I think that's perhaps the difference between bookkeeping and accounting. I know it sounds like a weird topic to have in the middle of a role play conversation, but a bookkeeper actually has his checks and columns and has to go everything with a fine tooth comb, whereas an accountant simply says, "Did you grab a receipt? Did we actually make that check?" you know. So creating a day-to-day log for a game master or for a games group might be a way to make that less onerous. If it's simply a bubble that they check at the beginning of the session. Did we check for a change in weather? Yep. Okay, we did. So we're done. Okay, because as we said, with it only being a roughly a 20% chance of something different occurring, it's not something enough that make it a burden on the players to have it be top of mind in front of their head. But on the other hand, if the game master, right, 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 right. Also, the other thing that I don't think very many people think about is the intensity of that effect. So, if they did roll, it's rainy today, then they make everybody do a check of their gear, and then they're done. But if it's, an incessant downpour, it's kind of, I mean, the very concept of inclement weather is much more than just a simple did precipitation come down to the ground in the form of rain. No, it's actually more than that. Is it a wall of water, Phoenix monsoon or San Francisco drizzle, It's a matter of intensity and duration that I think having just like you said, a checkpoint says, "Yep, there was a weather check." The storyteller can actually narrate that perhaps a little bit more cinematically or theatrically by describing the deeper details of that. Because if it is a flat out monsoon, players really should reconsider whether or not they're going to go walking through the mountains in a rainstorm. If it's deluge level, you might end up with a sudden gully washer, and now you're dealing with falling down a mountain. um, right, right. Well, and it's also the only time that the game master brings it up is when it's really, well, I'm actually checking to see whether or not this rainstorm became a water elemental. How intense did the rain come down? And that's all they check. Oh, you're welcome. So, I apologize in advance to any games group that may or may not be TPK'd because Scott decided to throw a water elemental at them. Alright, so let's go on to the next one here. Fog, haze, and dust. You talked about a sandstorm. Um, Sandstorms by themselves can be, particularly nasty. Generally speaking, they're relatively short in duration because they are literally a moving weather pattern. But I guess what I'm talking about when I'm speaking of fog, haze, and dust is I'm talking about how does that impact the actual flow of combat. Do you think about that at all in terms of when you're having your engagements or your encounters? That the like one of my favorite effects to use, and I haven't done it in a while, and so I have to thank you and apologize to my own groups now because Scott made me remember this one. Imagine knee-high fog, deep, thick, marshy, and what kind of an impact that would have if your enemies were all, I don't know, picnitties, the beings that live in the swamps, bullywugs, that are less than a foot tall. Imagine how much more fun that would be for the bullywugs to know that they could look up and see the enemy, but the enemy can't see them. Nope, nope. Actually, it's ultra common in boggy areas. we in Southern California we're like at the opposite of that. So we don't experience that. But if you are in the especially in the valleys of the Appalachians, there's quite often this will happen where the mist actually rises off of a body of water like a bog or a swamp, and it doesn't get much higher than the tops of the cattails and pussy willows and stuff because the humidity is being held in by the plant life, and so therefore the fog. Well, you've watched Dark Shadows. That's all about that. You know it's yeah, it's bog water basically. The humidity. It's I think mathematically they talk about it being the dew point of the moisture. So the lower water level is higher, but the coolness of the air above it causes the fog, the densely held in moisture to become opaque. And so, from a like I said, Dark Shadows is a great example. That house, Barnabas Collins's place, was it Collingridge? I can't remember. Collingswood. Yeah, is along the edge of that moor, that marsh, and so it's constantly got knee-high thready fog rolling through, and to me it's a great ad because if you're talking about an area where there are sec gen nerdlu or perhaps a incursion of slod, they work perfect because they're low and crouching to the ground, and therefore they can move almost completely unseen, and makes for jump scares. And okay, you don't see any enemy this round. Roll your in Nycos Grace check. Go ahead and make your Dex check. And then, waha! I got you. Jump and attack. That kind of thing. So it may. What's that? Yes. Yes. Or the tiny pixies are able to launch their entire volley of arrows from their formation that's only 12 feet away because they're so tiny they can sneak up on you. Yeah. Fun, fun, fun. The other thing to take into account too is what is the consistency and content of that obscuration. If it's dust, you have a chance of getting that blown in your face. Imagine what would happen if you get sand in your eyes. I mean, in real life, I have friends who go to like SCA functions or Ren Fair, and they go out to do battle, and it's hysterical to watch the one guy put his hand up, he put his sword on top of his head and say, "Stop! Stop! I can't see! So I got something in my eye!" It's like, if that really happened, dude, you're dead. Yeah, okay, you got a piece of sand in your eye. We're not calling off the battle. No, we can't. Sorry. So yeah, but again, from the standpoint of what we do with role play groups, can you imagine just throwing that one little bit in? Okay, got a chunk of sand in your eye. Make a resolve check. You can't. Your eyes are watering so bad you can't see out of either one of them, because that's an autonomic thing. Your body just does it. Ah! Stop attacking me! Another thing is, Yeah, see, well, if you getting an idea, I bet you're getting a whole box full of them. How about this one? What if that haze that's coming off of the bogs is actually blowing across uh, poison poison no no poison oak and poison ivy, and the breeze is moist, and it just happens to pick up the content chemical. Or maybe it's blowing across a pepper field. Ah, exactly. All it takes is one little kernel getting in there, and you're done. You're done. I can take you out. Yeah, I mean, the worse things than that have taken. I mean, simpler things than that have taken out armies too. But that's a one way to really mess with an enemy. And so it's also therefore gives hints to the players on what they might be able to do. I've had groups actually obscure their departure from a scene by throwing up a wall of cloud or whatever. But it's so much more powerful if you're able to throw in some cayenne pepper or something. Yeah, yeah. And then the final one here that doesn't get mentioned much, and maybe it's because most adventures happen inside of abandoned tombs, but crowds and collateral damage. I think often of the movie trope, at least, of the bar fight. There's a bunch of people in that room that were not combatants necessarily when you start your engagement. In the movies, you always see, especially if you watch the old. You remember back in the 80s and 90s when you'd have the bar fight in the traditional, you know, 1980s sci-fi fantasy drama was the girl in the the scanty little bra goes running across the screen screaming ah, because they have to show that it's, that there's danger involved in the area. And how often have you actually taken into account collateral damage from the adventures that your groups get into? Oh, really? Yeah, I found it. It's quite a change to a dynamic when the player group has to suddenly realize that they're fighting in a building and it started on a fire and there's somebody living upstairs. Now they got to find a way to get, you know, from a moral standpoint, they can't keep just punching people in the face. They've got to figure out how to get the. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's not incidental. That's not incidental damage. It's intentional. That's yeah. That you're right. It's a field far above. But I think that plays into the deeper conversation we had the other day about player intent. You know, if a player wants to consider everything around him as being non-relevant, then you might have that more so than you would if your players really thought they were in a living place. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I think in your case you have to call it a side seat because otherwise the mental images that I get are Gene in the back seat asking you, "Why are we doing this? Where is the exit? Why? Why?" So yeah, that's you don't want to get whacked in the back of the head. So make sure it's a side seat, so at least you can see it coming, right? All right, so in a kind of a quick review to round out the episode, when we talk about things like intentional add-ons, things like poisons, maybe bite venom, maybe it could even be disease like rabies or whatever. Adding that as an additional dimension is really only good if you have a way to make the follow-on realistic. To me, saying that okay, the insect gets to do X number of points of damage of this kind and Y amount of damage of this kind of defeats the purpose. You know, all it is just adding an extra damage sink. And I suppose in the world of hit point pools that kind of makes sense. But in a world that doesn't take that perspective, having the impact of the bite, the effect or whatever, occur over time, perhaps getting worse over time, and so there's always the scare that it's going to progress to, lethal levels. At least adds a level of fear and concern to the players, so they think about the implications of, say, getting involved in a conflict. Like, it's all well and good that you're gonna swat away a swarm of gnats who are just causing an inconvenience, and completely different if you know that if you get affected by that group of gnats, you might not be able to stand up in the morning. You'll treat them. Isn't that sound like fun? That's living life. That's when your character goes, "Oh, what did I do? I can't stand up this morning. What was it we got involved with yesterday? That group of gnats? Really? That's all there were? And yet I can't stand up today? Nah, it's not good." Therefore, the point of that, I think, is that the flavor of that can be really really colorful in a role play environment where your players are thinking about what goes on from day to day, whereas it'll have less impact if they don't. If they're looking at it from the cookie cutter of knock the door down, get kill the monster, grab the loot, they're not going to feel that nuance. And of course, then the very concept of disease, I would hazard a guess that probably 90% of game masters have never had anybody fall sick or deal with a disease in any fashion in a game session, other than something lethal like a plague or something. Because to do so is to consider the personas at a more gut level. Does that make sense? It seems to me that it's less likely that they'll deal with disease and such unless they find a way of seeing the characters as normal human beings. So what I'm hearing you say is that if there was a mechanism, say with the Nycos property, that you would have like a pre-printed daily sheet that would have the check marks for these things, that would be useful. Now the CIS is setting the conditions at the beginning. It's kind of like the well, to use a really good example, let's say we're talking about Westworld, and it's a byproduct of Delos Corporation that we have the default settings for the community at the beginning before we turn it on and everybody comes walking in. Check mark, check mark, check mark, check mark. Okay, now we know what our village is. So no, it's not a daily. There's not a daily log mechanism in that. So what we're talking about would be something that we could add on, certainly, and we can make it, especially when we're talking about the looking both ways and out the back window, making sure no one's seeing. I'm glad this is really just between us, and the potential millions of people that will see this, but the idea that there's that we could actually create this as part of an app, so there could be a Nycos app for your phone. I know, shh, be very, very quiet. Yeah, so it could be matter of fact. What if that was automated? So when you turned it on, you hit the button and it says, "Good morning in whatever, Dulcetville," or what's our town, Knoxburg. Welcome to Knoxburg. It's raining this morning, but it's got an 80% chance of clearing by lunchtime. Humidity is about 20%, so expect some fog out by the forest. That'd be kind of cool. I don't know anybody who would think of that. Anyway, moving on quickly, but therefore going to the conversation about whether, if the mechanism allowed for that weather check to be as near to automated as possible, not just a check mark that yes, it's raining, but how intense and for how long, would you find that to be useful? All right, and then finally, when your adventurers decide to get into a conflict, maybe consider ways of adding in crowds and collateral damage. It doesn't necessarily have to even be as blatant, as I said, as a bar fight or lighting a tavern on fire because the bad guys ran inside. Imagine that while your adventurers are fighting in one room of the tombs or whatever, that the carrion crawlers, who normally are down by the marsh portion of the dungeon, are suddenly being lured by the sounds of conflict. And so now well, many of the older modules had those kind of things contingency written, but almost always those were contingency written in a one-way direction. So there never was actually any consideration of what if it was reversed. I'm just saying that with any group, any potential condition is possible. And by keeping in mind that, yes, congratulations, you burned the monster, you've lit the troll on fire. Unfortunately, you are inside of the covered bridge yourselves, and now it's on fire. it adds nuances and depth to the scene that does help with the perception of reality, so to speak. Does that make sense? So I got you've given me a new project, so I've got to work on the daily sheet so we can get that uploaded to the NycosRPG website. I did want to mention for you guys as viewers, the fast play version of NycosRPG is now available at NycosRPG.com. You simply go there, hit the play now button, and one of the options is the fast the instant play download, and that has everything you need to start creating your own adventures. It does include a very small sampling of monster traits, so you can actually start building your creatures and such. And we will be getting ready for the pre-release version of the master book in the next couple of weeks, and that will also be available in theory. And I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. If you guys are enjoying the show, make sure you follow this on Twitch and check out our YouTube page at NycosRPG for many, many, many more videos. I think I got the official notification that I achieved the goal of 700 videos there. So I'm sure there's something that'll catch your fancy. That includes live stream videos from the olden days, as well as various pieces of the Game Masters Academy series and all of that. So I want to thank you, Abletop, for being here today. This has been a great conversation. Do you have any last words you would like to say to players who are taking into account the things we talked about today? Cool. So I will do a video probably tonight about poisons, venoms, and toxins. In particular, going over the different ways and means of inserting such into your game sessions. Thanks again, Abletop, for being here. We will talk again soon. I know that Victor is pushing for the two of you to get together on the show and basically repost, and I'm looking forward to that as well. And so thank you, everybody, for being here. We will see you the next time. Remember, we are on 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time every day, Monday through Friday. And don't forget also that if you become a member of the Patreon program, you can join us on our Saturday and Sunday games. Okay, we will talk to you guys all later. Have a great way. Great way? Great way. Yes, get paid to wages. All right.